Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from Jane Austen to Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and leverage insights from literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the rescuing of Western civilization at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 101. That's right. It is our 101st episode of the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. We are heading back on this 101st episode. We are returning to take in more of the magnum opus of the leader of the church in Hippo. The author of this book preached widely and wrote voluminous biblical commentaries and apologetic works, defending Christian faith against its rivals and detractors in the Roman Empire, along with more personal and pastoral works such as Confessions. Now, we've covered this guy before, and we will continue to cover him. His book is really quite thick. It's close to 1,200 pages. And of course, we can never cover all of that. So, in this episode, we will continue our years-long reading and analysis of selections from books 5 and 6 of the seminal Christian apologetic from the year 300, The City of God by St. Augustine of Hippo. Leaders, just remember, everybody has to worship something. Now, we covered books 3, 2, and 1 in previous episodes of the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. As a matter of fact, you may want to go back and listen to episode number 8 and episode number 62 of this podcast if you want to catch up. By the way, episode number 62, we covered a lot of the elements of City of God, book 4 with Tom Libby. So in case you didn't know, I'm going to kind of go into sort of how this book is divided up, and then we'll jump right into, I know I said we're going to do book 4 and book 5, but we'll pick up with some elements at the end of book 4 for our analysis today, and then we'll go right into book 5. The way City of God is divided, and Augustine says this himself, is he develops an argument in the first of his 5 books that gives a refutation of those who suppose, and this is quoting directly from Augustine, refutation of those who suppose that many false gods are to be venerated and worshipped for advantages in this mortal life and for benefits in temporal things. They would accord them the ceremonies and the humble devotions which the Greeks call latreia, a worship due only to the one true God. Christian truth proves those quote-unquote gods to be useless images or unclean spirits and malignant demons, creatures at any rate, and not the Creator, close quote. So that's what Augustine is doing in the first 5 books of City of God. He's breaking down the Roman pagan world. He's challenging the Roman pagan world. As a matter of fact, and I'll talk about this on the other side of this segment, he's pushing an idea that would come to be popular from about the 4th century in Christian apologetic arguments against secular and pagan culture. It would come to be popular from the 4th century, but would be abandoned by the 18th century, called pushing the antithesis. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So that's what he's doing in books 1 through 5. And so we covered a lot of the elements of his argument in book 4, but I want to pick up with book 4, chapter 4, where Augustine lays out a basic idea that I think is helpful for our time in the 21st century. And I quote, "Remove justice, and what are kingdoms but gangs of criminals on a large scale? What are criminal gangs but petty kingdoms? A gang is a group of men under the command of a leader, bound by a compact of association in which the plunder is divided according to an agreed convention. If this villainy wins so many recruits from the ranks of the demoralized that it acquires territory, establishes a base, captures cities, and subdues peoples, it then openly arrogates to itself the title of kingdom, which is conferred on it in the eyes of the world, not by the renouncing of aggression, but by the attainment of impunity." For it was a witty and truthful rejoinder which was given by a captured pirate to Alexander the Great. The king asked the fellow, what is your idea in infesting the sea?" And the pirate answered, with uninhibited insolence, "The same as yours in infesting the earth. But because I do it with a tiny craft, I'm called a pirate. Because you have a mighty navy, you're called an emperor." Close quote. By the way, that's reflected in something, I believe it was, that Stalin wrote. If you kill one man, you're a murderer. If you kill 1,000,000 men, well, you're a ruler. Now I go back further into chapter 3 of book 4, again, laying out some ideas for you here, and I quote again from Augustine. "I also promise to show for what moral qualities in the Romans and for what ends the true God, in whose power are all kingdoms, deigned to assist the growth of the Roman Empire, and to demonstrate how utterly useless was the help of those supposed gods, whose trickery and deceit in fact did them so much harm. Hence it is clear to me that I must now enter on this topic and treat especially of the growth of the Roman Empire, for I have dwelt already at a considerable length, particularly in Book 2, on the harm done by the delusions of the demons, whom the Romans worshipped as gods, and their disastrous effect on Roman morality. While throughout all the 3 books now completed, I have pointed out the consolations which God, even in the midst of the horrors of war, has bestowed through the name of Christ, which the barbarians hold in such respect, consolations foreign to the normal usage of war, granted to good and bad alike, in the same way as God makes the sun rise on the good and on the bad, and sends the rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." Close quote. And I pick up later, "Is it reasonable, is it sensible to boast of the extent and grandeur of an empire when you cannot show that men lived in happiness as they passed their lives amid the horrors of war, amid the shedding of men's blood, whether the blood of enemies or fellow citizens, under the shadow of fear, and amid the terror of ruthless ambition? For the evils inflicted on the righteous by their wicked masters are not punishments for crime, but tests of virtue. The good man, though a slave, is free. The wicked, though he reigns, is a slave, and not the slave of a single man, but, what is far worse, the slave of as many masters as he has vices." So this one's going to seem a little bit disjointed today, and I apologize. I'm recovering from illness, and so hey, you know, some days you win, some days you lose, and some days it rains. But I think I'm on the other side of my illness, and I finished the selection that we're reading today in City of God. I finished the elements of book 4 and 5 just last night. And so I'm kind of putting it all together in my head. Now, one of the reasons I really enjoy City of God is because that first 4 books really does define, at least in my mind, how a person of faith should argue. And by the way, this can be any kind of faith, whether you have a political faith, an economic faith, a social or cultural faith. I believe that Augustine lays out philosophically a way to address dominant culture, particularly in a post-Hegelian dialectic world and world of argumentation that we live in now. I don't see a lot of folks really doing this, particularly a lot of folks who have deep religious belief. Matter of fact, I see a lot of folks arguing in a reactive manner or reacting reactively to the world around them, to the changes that they are seeing in morality, in transcendence, and even in the structure of reality itself. If we were to exhume the corpse of St. Augustine and reanimate him, I believe he would look around and he would recognize the world that we are currently inhabiting, at least in the West, and particularly in the United States of America. I think he would recognize this world as a mirror of the world that he was arguing in. As a matter of fact, he set himself against the Roman world quite robustly in books 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of City of God. It is a study in how to do that. It's a study in how to argue without being liked. It's a study in how to be disagreeable and how to disagree, while at the same time creating arguments that the people who are opposed to you cannot overcome. St. Augustine engaged in a method of theological argumentation called pushing the antithesis. And basically what this means is he says, hey, okay, you're Roman pagans. You believe that Jupiter and Minerva and whatever the Pantheon of gods it is, Mars that you have, are really the ones that are responsible for your success, for your morality, for your ethics, for your avarice, for your greed, for your weather. You believe that these gods are responsible for all that happens to you and all that you do. Okay, I'm going to take you at your word. But instead of appealing to Christian morals, instead of appealing to Jesus, I'm going to demand of you that you stay on your own ground. And I'm going to stay on my own ground, and I'm going to show that my ground is better without appealing to your gods. And I want you to show, this is the challenge to you, this is the Pepsi challenge. I want you to show that your ground is better without appealing to my God, without appealing to Jesus. Because we've had Jesus in the Western world for the last 2,000 years, this is really, really hard for moderns to understand. It's hard for, in particular, well, not moderns, postmoderns to understand, like us, because we live in such a world that is so infused with the ethics, the morality, and even the worldview of Christianity. It's buried so deeply into our DNA now that to imagine arguing the antithesis, our enemies, our theological, our psychological, our social, our cultural enemies, people who are actively opposed to Christianity, they can't even argue their position without eventually falling onto or falling into or falling back on Christian conceptions of how the world should work. Now, many thinkers, debaters, politicians, scientists, and philosophers in the West, since even the time of Plato, have engaged in the dialectical argumentation process of pushing the antithesis on their enemies. This is not new. And even Jesus engaged in this process of pushing the antithesis against the Pharisees and the religious leaders, the Sadducees and others during his time. By the way, at the time of this recording, it is going to be Easter in the Western world here, coming up in a few days, and we are approaching Good Friday and the Passover at the time of this recording. Now, in our time, and it is something to point out, particularly in our post-Hegelian time, where contemporary thinking has been captured almost fully by an atheistic Marxist conception of reality, pushing the antithesis on Marxists, or pushing the antithesis on Hegelians, or pushing the antithesis on what are soon to be our modern pagan rituals and gods, sounds like disagreeableness to our itching ears. But what Augustine shows is it's really the only option for moving forward in a world that seems to be fracturing apart at the seams. So let's head back to the book. Back to City of God by St. Augustine of Hippo. We're going to pick up a little bit later in his argumentation, just so I can sort of build an idea here with you. So we're going to start off in Book 5. And he says in Book 5, in the preface to Book 5, he says, and I quote, "It is an undisputed fact that felicity is the complete enjoyment of all that is to be desired. Felicity is not a goddess, but a gift of God, and therefore no god is to be worshipped by men except the God who can make men happy. If felicity were in fact a goddess, then she would rightly be called the sole divinity worthy of worship. But God alone has power to bestow those blessings which can be received even by those who are not good and therefore are not happy. Let us therefore proceed to inquire why God was willing that the Roman Empire should extend so widely and last so long. We have already asserted at some length that this was not due to the multitude of false gods the Romans worshipped, and we shall have more to say on this if occasion offers." Close quote. By the way, that idea right there, that God has the power to bestow blessings on those who are not good and therefore are not happy, is answer to the question, why does tyranny continue? So he starts off with, in book 4, I apologize, it's not book 4 or book 1, it's book 5, chapter 1. He starts off, Augustine does, in addressing the Roman penchant for assuming that the stars, in essence astrology, control the ways in which men behave. And we have astrology in our time, you can open up, well, when we had newspapers, you could open up the newspaper and see, what's going to be happening with your fate, right? Or with your with your day or your week or whatever, right? And now we have, of course, this exact same kind of stuff online where people, go to astrology, people go to tarot readings, people go to all kinds of different things in order to determine the future. And Augustine goes at this directly. And so I'm going to start off early in book 5, chapter 1 with this. And I quote, "Our present argument is not addressed to such as these, but against those who oppose the Christian religion in defense of their supposed gods. As for those who make the position of the stars depend on the will of God, when they in some way decide the character of each person and what blessing and what harm is to come his way, if they think that those stars have this power deputed to them by the supreme power of God, and that it is their will that decides, then they do the heavens a grave injustice in supposing that in that shining Senate, as we may call it, and in that resplendent Senate House, they decreed the commission of crimes so abominable that if any earthly state had decreed them, its own destruction would have been decreed by the whole of humanity. And then if men act under pressure of such heavenly constraint, what room is left for the judgment of God, who is the Lord of stars and of men? While if they say that the stars, having received power from God omnipotent, do not take on those decisions at their own whim, but are merely fulfilling his commands when they impose those constraints, are we then to think of God himself in a way which seemed completely unworthy when we were thinking of the stars as deciding? But it may be said that the stars give notice of events and do not bring those events about, so that the position of the stars becomes a kind of statement, predicting, not producing, future happenings. And this has been an opinion held by men of respectable intelligence. Now, this is not the way the astrologers normally talk. They would not say, for example, this position of Mars signifies murder. They say it causes murder. Then later on, he kind of gets into it a little bit on this idea of nature versus nurturer. And he talks about dissimilarity in the health of twins. This is in chapter 2 of book 5. And I quote, "Thus the coincidence which the physician believed due to a similar constitution, the philosopher and astrologer ascribed to the configuration of the stars existing at the moment of their conception and of their birth," talking about twins. In a case like this, the medical assumption is more acceptable and more credible from the start, since it is possible that the physical condition of the parents at the moment of conception may affect the earliest beginnings of infants then conceived, so that after their initial development in the mother's body, they are born with a like constitution. Thereafter, they are reared in the same house with the same food, in the same climate and situation, drinking the same water, and medical science avers that those factors have the greatest influence, for good or ill, on physical condition. Twins are also used to do the same kinds of exercise. All those similarities produce the same kind of physique, and so they fall ill of the same diseases, at the same time from the same causes. But to trace this parallelism of illness to the influence of the configuration of stars at the moment of conception and birth is an odd kind of impudence, seeing that so many conceptions and births could have been subject to the influences of the same aspect of the sky, producing beings of widely different races, vastly diverse in their actions and experiences. Now, we know quite well that twins may be very different in their behavior. They may go different places. They may also differ in their medical history. And as far as I can see, Hippocrates offers the easiest explanation of this divergence in respect of illness in ascribing it to differences in diet and exercise, which arise not from physical temperament, but from deliberate choice. And then I go to chapter 3. Nothing is to be gained by bringing in the well-known parable of the potter's wheel, given by Nigidius, who was an astrologer. This is an aside. Nigidius was an astrologer and a Pythagorean philosopher, reputedly the most learned man in Rome after Varro. He was of some service to Cicero in 63 BC during the Catiline's conspiracy. He sided with Pompey in the Civil War, and he died in exile in 45 BC. So that's who Augustine is talking about here. And Nigidius created a parable in regards to this problem of the parallelism of twins, which greatly troubled him. A parable that gave him his nickname, Figulus, or the potter. He revolved a potter's wheel with all the vigor he could command, and while it was spinning, he made 2 very rapid strokes on the wheel with ink, apparently in the same spot. When the wheel stopped, those marks were found to be a considerable distance apart on the edge of it. In the same way, said Nigidius, the sky whirls round so swiftly that although twins may be born in as quick succession as my 2 strokes on the wheel, that corresponds to a very large tract of the sky. This would account for all the great divergences alleged in the character of twins and in the events of their lives. This parable, this is Augustine, is even more fragile than the pottery made on that wheel. For if a change in the constellations, which cannot be observed, makes such a difference in the sky that one of the 2 twins gets advantages from heredity, while the other does not, how could those astrologers have the boldness to examine the constellations, in the case of those who are not twins, and then foretell matters which depend on this unobservable mystery, and connect them with the moment of birth? Perhaps they can make those statements in the horoscopes of those who are not twins, because there we are dealing with longer intervals of time, while the few instants that may separate the births of twins are assumed to affect minor matters on which astrologers are not normally consulted. For no one is going to ask advice about when to sit down, when to take a walk, or when to have a meal. But we are certainly not here talking of minor matters. The many why differences between twins that we are pointing out are found in their character, their actions, and the events of their lives. At this point, you're probably groaning, if you're still listening, even. Why is he talking about astrology and Augustine and all of this again? Well, and if you've made it this far, you're probably also asking, how the hell does this actually apply to leadership? Well, maybe you won't use the word hell, but you may say heck, or how does this apply to leadership? You're probably a lot nicer than me. And like I said, I'm a little bit on edge because I'm recovering from being ill, and I always get a little sharp when I'm recovering from being ill. But that's no excuse, right? So here's where I'm going, and here's the reason why I'm talking about all of this today. If you've made it this far and you haven't shut off the podcast yet. Look, the reason all this matters is not because of astrology. The reason that these arguments that Augustine is making against the astrologers in the Roman world, the pagan astrologers in the Roman world, the reason why all this matters is because we are now 1900 years on the other side of St. Augustine, and all of the old problems are beginning to remanifest themselves. The pagan ideals are beginning to reassert themselves in the world. And it begins with small things, like believing that we have no free will. And that's what astrology is. That's fundamentally what the worship of astrology is. That's fundamentally what the worship of auguring is. Or the practice, not the worship, the practice of auguring is, which is where you look at the entrails of a dead animal and try to figure things out, or what the process of going to an oracle is. Look, human beings, particularly human beings in the West, have had a long, hard climb out of the pit of looking to the natural world to provide them with answers for meaning, answers for justice, answers for ethics, and most importantly, answers for evil. And part of that long, hard slog, part of that long, hard climb out of the pit that Augustine basically set the table, or I should say set the table, but he set the path moving forward to climb out of that pit. At the end of it, we seem to have arrived in the exact same spot that we left. And you're beginning to see this from our very sophisticated, very highly educated, technological philosophers who are now saying there is no such thing as free will. They're running around on podcasts and they're writing books. They're doing interviews. And it's no longer just in higher education. It's no longer just a philosophical thought experiment. You have people actually building artificial intelligence programs on the idea that your behavior and my behavior can be manipulated because we actually can't make any decisions based on anything outside ourselves. Matter of fact, they're saying which is something even worse, they're saying that the behaviors that we have don't come from anywhere and they don't have any meaning. We are merely just automated machines. And if we're automated machines, the concept of worship, the concept of what we pay attention to, then becomes moot. This is worth confronting because this leads us down a very, very dangerous path. We have to confront the pagan ideal because it is going to be made real. And by the way, paganism has always lurked underneath the Christian world, sprouting like weeds in your front yard after the first spring rain. Paganism is the default setting for human belief. Not believing in nothing, as many moderns and postmoderns have convinced themselves in their own time. You will, as Bob Dylan said, serve somebody. That's almost inevitable. And in our time, there are more pagans, and people don't call themselves that except the most outrageous of us, but we do behave in a pagan fashion, and we do serve ourselves. We serve our objects, like the phones in our hands, or the cars in our yard, or the jobs that we have. We serve our beliefs, or we serve the hedonistic pursuit of pleasure, and there's more of us now doing that than ever before. And of course, with Google Gemini and ChatGPT and Grok, pagan god-sounding names all, we are now on the cusp of a return to the ancient pagan worship of the physical representation of our quote-unquote gods. If this seems esoteric and really weird to you, if this seems like it never could happen, just wait. Soon to come, to a street corner near you, will be a pagan temple with an AI god inside of it, where you will be able to augur your future based on your stars. All the while, the technologists who built that will tell you that you have no free will at all. Hello. So I'm going to do some shilling here, and hopefully this will be a pause in our riveting conversation for you. I have an offer for you. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership. It's available in paperback, hardcover, or as an ebook on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place you order books. Now, in this book, I address the 12 leadership areas that I have found leaders need to be the most intentional in to be the type of leader followers actually want to follow. From establishing a foundation of leading teams through managing conflict effectively, all the way through leading teams through change, knowing what to do and why to do it can help readers, like the ones listening to this show, become better leaders. Look, reading this book and living it is like getting coaching from me directly without having to pay my full coaching rate. Head on over to leadershiptoolbox.us, that's leadershiptoolbox.us, and scroll down the homepage and click on the Buy Now button to purchase in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle format on Amazon 12 Rules for Leaders, the foundation for intentional leadership. And that's it for me. Now back to the show. Okay, so what does Augustine say about all this? What's my support for my assertion? Well, that's where we go back to the book. Back to City of God by St. Augustine. By the way, I would recommend picking up a copy of City of God. You could pick up the Pagan Classics version. It's actually very, very good, very, very deep. There's a lot of elements in it, including further readings. The introduction itself is about 40 pages, and it introduces you to Augustine, the world of the Roman Empire that he was writing against, and sort of how this post-Jesus Christianity was developing over the course of time. So I'd recommend getting the Pagan Classics version. You could also pick up open source versions that are floating around on the internet. I believe that there are a couple on LibriVox and a couple of other places where you can pick up open source books. All right, so back to City of God, Book 5. So let's go to Chapter 12. And in chapter 12, Augustine asserts that the moral character in the ancient Romans, which earned from the true God the increase of their empire, although they did not worship him. So Augustine's assertion is that God, the one true God, divvies up gifts to those he likes and those he doesn't equally, right? And that the law of God runs the universe. And you don't need to look to astrologers or you don't need to look to minor gods. You don't need to look to pagan worship in order to determine what this is. You need to look to the one true God. And he builds an argument about this in he bases his argument on this idea of the Roman qualities, the things that Romans valued in their culture. And he starts off chapter 12 in book 5 with this idea. Let us go on to examine for what moral qualities and for what reason the true God deigned to help the Romans in the extension of their empire, for in his control are all the kingdoms of the earth. Now, according to the witnesses of the historians, the ancient Romans, those of the earliest epoch, no doubt worshipped false gods like the other races, except only the Hebrew people, and sacrificed victims not to God, but to demons. Nevertheless, they were, quote-unquote, greedy for praise, generous with their money, and aimed at vast renown and honorable riches, close quote. They were passionately devoted to glory. It was for this that they desired to live, and for this they did not hesitate to die. This unbounded passion for glory, above all else, checked their other appetites. They felt it would be shameful for their country to be enslaved, but glorious for her to have dominion and empire, and so they set their hearts first on making her free, then on making her sovereign. Now, he goes on to talk about Sallust and Nero Caesar and Marcus Cato and Gaius Caesar, and he talks about how Cato and Sallust wrote, and these were two Roman thinkers, wrote about glory and honor and power. And of course, they associated glory and honor and power in Rome with the felicity, the goodness of their gods. But Augustine does not. Matter of fact, he picks up later in chapter 12 and says this. At the time when Sallust was writing and Virgil was composing his poem, which would be the Aeneid, moral corruption was already general and widespread, and men thus corrupted did not seek position and glory by Virgil's quote-unquote arts, but schemed for them by trickery and deceit. Hence, Sallust tells us, it was at first ambition rather than greed that worked on men's hearts, a vice closer to a virtue. The true man and the worthless wretch alike covet glory, honor, and power, but the true man directs his efforts along the right way. The man who lacks the moral qualities works towards his goals by trickery and deceit. These moral qualities enable a man to arrive at honor, glory, and power by merit, not by the tricks of the canvasser. The aims are shared by the true man and the worthless wretch, but the true man directs his efforts along the right way. That is the way of merit. It is by this way that he strives towards his goal, towards glory, honor, and power. That this feeling was innate in the Romans is shown by the establishment of temples, very near to each other, to the gods' virtue and honor. They thought of these gifts of God as being themselves divinities. From this, one can realize what they wish to be consummation of merit, what they wish to be the consummation of merit, what the good man connected with merit, it was honor. Although the bad men desired honor, they did not possess it, since they tried to win it by dishonest means, by trickery and deceit. Cato is given even higher praise. Sallust says of him, the less he sought glory, the more it pursued him. Glory, the object of the Romans' burning ambition, is the judgment of men when they think well of others. That is why virtue is superior to glory, since it is not content with the testimony of men without the witness of a man's own conscience. Hence the apostle says, you talk about Paul the apostle, this is our glory, the testimony of our own conscience. And in another place, let each man test his own work, and thus he will have his glory in himself, not in another. Therefore, glory, honor, and power, those Roman aims, which the good men strove to attain by honorable means, must be the consequences of virtue, not its antecedents. And then a little later on, there were thus two Romans of eminent qualities at that period, Caesar and Cato. But Cato's qualities evidently approached far more near to the true ideal of virtue than did those of Caesar. Accordingly, if we want a picture of the condition of the Commonwealth at that time and of its previous condition, we may find it in Cato's judgment when he says, quote, and this is Augustine quoting from Cato, "Do not imagine that it was by the force of arms that our ancestors made a great nation out of a small community. If that were true, we should today have a far more glorious nation. In allies, in our own citizens, in armaments, and horses, we have greater resources than they enjoyed. But it was other causes that made them great, causes that with us have ceased to exist. Energy in our own land, a rule of justice outside our borders, informing policy, a mind that is free because not at the mercy of criminal passions. Instead of these, we have self-indulgence and greed, public poverty and private opulence. We praise riches, we pursue a course of sloth. No distinction is made between good men and bad. The intrigues of ambition win the prizes due to merit. No wonder when each of you thinks only of his own private interests. When at home you are slaves to your appetites and to money and influence in your public life. The consequence is that an attack is being launched on a republic left without defenses." Close quote. These words of Cato, or of Sallust, might lead one to suppose that all the Romans of antiquity, or the majority of them, resembled those of whom they speak so highly. That is not so. Otherwise, the remarks of the same historian quoted in my second book would be untrue. Sallust tells us that the injustices of the powerful classes led to a secession of the plebeians from the patricians, and that from the beginning there were other domestic dissensions, and that the era of just moderation in government lasted after the expulsion of the kings, only as long as the threat from Tarquin remained, until the end of the major war against Etruria, which Rome had engaged in because of Tarquin. But after that, the plebeians were treated like slaves under the rule of the patricians, who handled them with the same violence as the kings, drove them from their lands, and wielded sole power, all others being disenfranchised. These discords, with one side aiming at domination, the other seeking to avoid slavery, were only ended by the Second Punic War, because then once again came the pressure of a serious threat, which checked their restless spirits and distracted them from these disorders by a more urgent anxiety and recalled them to domestic concord. The moral qualities of Rome, right? And it's interesting that Augustine quotes Cato extensively in this chapter 12 of Book 5 of City of God, because Cato, of course, is reminiscing, as many folks do in our time, and is bound to thinking about and to considering and to, of course, wanting a return to the quote-unquote good old days. In America, both liberals and conservatives, political liberals and political conservatives, are both hamstrung by an idealized vision of the 1950s. You see this in right-wing circles with the trad wives movement, but you also see this on the left with their continuing insistence on finding racism where there is none. Being hidebound to the past doesn't allow you as a leader to move forward to the future. And of course, lamenting that qualities that you seek to see in the current era and that you would like to see replicated in the future only existed in the past doesn't allow you to actually develop those qualities in the present for the future. Cato believed that Rome was better when every Roman was pursuing glory, honor, and power. And yet, of course, Augustine points out that the patricians and the plebeians separated so that they could have a nice little contretemps with each other when there was no contretemps to be had with people who were outside their borders, when they could not establish power or dominion over them. Now, there's a challenge in our time, right? Because we are at the end, as I've been saying on this podcast this entire year, we are at the end of the fourth turning. And it is time for us to begin in this country, and this conversation is already starting, but it's time for us to begin thinking about and to begin to consider what kind of people are we going to be in the spring part of the next seculum cycle that's scheduled to begin here in about another 4, maybe 5 years. Now, I know, many people, when you look around, you see nothing but chaos, right? You see nothing but division. You see nothing but despair. You are wondering where the leaders are who will lead us out of this. And the leaders are here. They are around. But they're leaders where the moral character that they are going to evince is going to come out looking differently in different ways than the moral character of leaders from the last 80-year cycle, the last, to use a Roman word, seculum. How does this all tie into paganism? How does this all tie into Google Gemini and ChatGPT and free will? Well, all these things layer on top of each other, and it's important for leaders to understand what the layers in the cake actually are. That's part of the reason why I do this podcast. That's part of the reason why I'm covering a 1,200-page book that's really complicated, like City of God, right? I'm not doing it purely for my own health and my own curiosity, although it is beneficial to both of those areas. I'm doing it because it lays the foundation. It lays an option for us as leaders moving forward about how to talk about moral character in a seculum spring. Because if moral character is defined by paganism and is defined as at a pagan root, the spring will be okay. Don't get me wrong. I do believe fundamentally, as St. Augustine does, that God will pour out blessings on the bad or the good alike. But I also believe fundamentally that those blessings will be squandered if we are engaged in pagan cultural worship. Christian moral character, and we know this from the last 1900 years of Western history, Christian moral character, living and worship, creates a visible, verbal, and worldview antithesis to the increasing insistence on a pagan moral character and worldview. From where do you get your moral authority? This is the question leaders need to seriously consider the answer to, because without knowing from where that moral authority comes, they will not be able to lead people with an unquestioned paganistic worldview in the next seculum spring. By the way, some of those people who are going to be in the next seculum spring, those people are Gen Zers. And there's about 65 to 85 million of them. Yeah. They're going to be very, very comfortable with going to the AI astrologers and worshiping at the AI temples on the corners of your local community. Cultural worship is another form of paganism that is grounded in a false thesis. St. Augustine knew this when confronting Roman culture, that whole glory and honor thing. And leaders need to know this when confronting a culture, a postmodern culture, driven by the flattening that is provided by large language algorithms that are euphemistically called AI. I do believe we are at an inflection moment around this and around these ideas, and leaders push the antithesis to the cultural paganism promoted through these algorithms. And the leaders who do that pushing, the leaders who have the courage to promote and push the antithesis, will lead to the development of robust and deeply moral ideas, movements, and institutions that will be fundamentally sound and resilient, and of course resistant to the siren call of the ever-flattening algorithm. By the way, the worship of the ever-flattening algorithm is probably the worst worship you can probably engage in. And leaders should be careful about what they set their eyes to, but they should also be careful about what they set their leadership to. Look, we've been exploring this question during the first quarter of this year of where your moral authority comes from. We asked it in the episode that we covered on Charles Portis's True Grit. We also answered and asked that question when we talked about Malcolm X during Black History Month. It is a core question because leaders must speak with authority. But the leaders that are the most effective don't speak with authority coming from economics or social standing or cultural standing. I mean, heck, even back in the Roman Empire, the patricians had to hold down the plebeians, such as it is even in our time. Where does your moral authority come from? What is your worldview? Who or what do you worship? Leaders must think deeply and critically about the answers to these questions, and Augustine shows us the way here at the end of the fourth turning as we get ready to lead in the next cycle of Western history. So back to the book, back to City of God by St. Augustine. I'm going to pick up a very brief section here in Book 5, Chapter 18. Something that I want to point out that I think is highly important for thinking about leadership in the coming fourth turning. And I quote from Book 5, Chapter 17 and 18. The Romans themselves lived under the same laws as they imposed on the rest. If this imposition had happened without the aid of Mars and Bellona, so that victory had no hand in it, for there would have been no fighting and therefore no victors, the condition of the Romans and of the other peoples would have been precisely the same, especially if they had, without delay, taken the step which they took later to win gratitude for their humanity by associating in the Commonwealth as Roman citizens all those who belonged to the Roman Empire, for this granted to all a privilege formerly enjoyed by a few. There is one exception to this equality. The Roman lower classes, possessing no land, lived at the public expense. The contributions to their upkeep would have been furnished with a better grace had they been presented voluntarily through the agency of equitable administrators after a peaceful compact instead of being taken by extortion from conquered peoples. As far as I can see, the distinction between victors and vanquished has not the slightest importance for security, for moral standards, or even for human dignity. It is merely a matter of the arrogance of human glory, the coin in which these men received their reward, quote-unquote, who were on fire with unlimited lust for glory and waged their wars of burning fury. Is it the case that the conqueror's lands are exempt from taxes? Have the victors access to knowledge forbidden to the others? Are there not many senators in other lands who do not know Rome even by sight? Take away national complacency, and what are all men but simply men? If the perverse standards of the world would allow men to receive honors proportional to their deserts, even so the honor of men should not be accounted an important matter. Smoke has no weight. For all that, even in this, we may profit from the goodness of our Lord God. Let us consider all the hardships these conquerors made light of, all the sufferings they endured, and the desires they suppressed to gain the glory of men. They deserve to receive that glory as a reward for such virtues. Let this thought avail to suppress pride in us. That city, in which it had been promised that we shall reign, differs from this earthly city as widely as the sky from the earth, life eternal from temporal joy, substantial glory from empty praises, the society of angels from the society of men, the light of the maker of the sun and moon from the light of the sun and the moon. Therefore the citizens of so great a country should not suppose that they have achieved anything of note, if to attain that country they had done something good or endured some ills, seeing that those Romans did so much and suffered so much for the earthly country they already possessed. What gives special point to this comparison is that the remission of sins, the promise which recruits the citizens for the eternal country, finds a kind of shadowy resemblance in that refuge of Romulus, where the offer of impunity for crimes of every kind collected a multitude which was to result in the foundation of the city of Rome. This being so, it is such that a great thing that one should despise for the sake of the eternal and heavenly country all the attractions of this present life, however beguiling, if, for the sake of this temporal and earthly country, Brutus had the strength to kill his sons, a thing which that other country compels no one to do. It is surely harder a thing to put one's sons to death than to do what has to be done for the celestial country, to give to the poor the possessions which one had supposed should be collected and preserved for one's children, or to let them go, if a temptation should appear which made that course necessary for the sake of faith and righteousness. Happiness, whether for us or for our children, is not the result of earthly riches, which must either be lost by us in our lifetime or else must pass after our death into the possession of those we do not know, or it may be of those whom we do not wish to have them. It is God who gives happiness, for he is the true wealth of men's souls. Smoke has no weight. Yeah, Augustine's right. Smoke doesn't have any weight. Unfortunately, we live in a world currently where there is a lot of smoke and not a lot of fire. The algorithms won't save us, and the pagan worship of the ideal, or the pagan ideal, won't save us either. But what may save us is pushing the antithesis. What may save us is understanding that we have to serve somebody and we better pick who we serve well. What may save us is the truth, is understanding the truth of reality itself. St. Augustine of Hippo was convinced of the truth of reality that we have been stripped of in the West in our postmodern era. But fortunately for us, the basic truth is still available to us to access in the book, the one book that continues to defy every attempt to squash it. There's a Latin idea that comes out of Catholicism, but it's good for Protestants to hear this too. We should live coram Deo. We should live as if God is watching. Rage Against the Machine once infamously said, "You don't gotta burn the books, you just remove them." Well, actually, I would alternately change that and say you don't got to burn the books, just make sure nobody reads them and they're all watching TikTok and Instagram reels. What are leaders going to do about all this? What's the leadership posture in the face of Augustine, in the face of, well, being questioned about where you get your moral authority from? Leaders must reconvince themselves. We must re-persuade ourselves. And I'm beginning to see this happen on the intellectual political left, at least in the United States and maybe even globally. Leaders must reconvince themselves of that immovable, immutable truth. The truth of the God of the Bible. The truth of Jesus Christ. They must convince themselves, reconvince themselves of that immovable, immutable truth to successfully combat the seemingly overwhelming power of the techno-high priests of a pagan New World Order. And that is the crisis that we are ginning up to have, probably within the next 3 or 4 years, as we close out the end of the fourth turning and move into an awakening. An awakening led by leaders who may reject the pagan ideal, may reject the atheistic assumptions underneath it. Because when you get to the end of atheism, really, what do you have? Environmentalism won't save you. Climate alarmism won't save you. Transcendental LSD use won't save you. all these other religions won't save you. But Augustine would say that the only thing that's going to save you is the eternal truth of Jesus Christ. And many, intellectually, are getting to this conclusion as well. And none too late. Matter of fact, they might be coming there right on time. The crisis, the collision that's going to happen between these two worldviews is building right now, and that's what we're all sort of collectively, spiritually holding our breath, I believe, around. But as we close out the fourth turning and move into a historical, cyclical spring, this crisis and the solutions for it will be minimized as a problem. But just because it will be minimized as a problem does not mean that it won't require clear-eyed exegesis on exactly the ground on which our moral authority lies in the future. Because, if I may be so prophetic, just like historical cycles go round and around, crises go around and around too. And if we don't solve successfully for this crisis this time around, it will lay lurking underneath the soil of our externalities and our assumptions in the West, ready to sprout once again at the end of the next seculum cycle. And well, that's it for me. Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast today. And now that you've made it this far, you should subscribe to the audio version of this show on all the major podcast players, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, YouTube Music, and everywhere else where podcasts are available. There's also a video version of our podcast on our YouTube channel. Like and subscribe to the video version of this podcast on the Leadership Toolbox channel on YouTube. Just search for Leadership Toolbox and hit the subscribe button there on YouTube. And while you're doing that, leave a 5-star review if you like what we're doing here on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Just go below the player and hit 5 stars. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to help grow this show. And tell all your friends, of course, in leadership. By the way, if you don't like what we're doing here, well, you can always listen to another leadership show. There are several other good ones out there. At least that's what I've heard. All right. Well, that's it for me.